April 7, 1945, 12:34 p.m., the East China Sea, 200 miles southwest of Kyushu. Captain Kasaku Aruga stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, watching American aircraft materialize through the scattered clouds like locusts descending on a harvest. Over 400 of them. His ship, the largest battleship ever constructed, carried enough armor to shrug off torpedoes that would sink lesser vessels. Her main guns could hurl shells weighing as much as a small car over 26 miles, with accuracy that defied comprehension. Yet Aruga knew, with the certainty that comes from facing inevitable death, that his ship was already lost, not because she lacked firepower or protection, but because the war had fundamentally changed. The weapon system he commanded represented the pinnacle of naval architecture from an era that had ended 4 years earlier at Pearl Harbor. The Americans had learned the lesson Japan taught them. Air power had rendered the battleship obsolete. What the American pilots diving toward Yamato that afternoon didn't know was that they were attacking more than a ship. They were destroying a dream, a national symbol, and the last vestige of Imperial Japan's conviction that steel and courage could triumph over industrial reality. The story of Yamato is not simply about the largest battleship ever built. It's about how national pride, strategic miscalculation, and brilliant engineering combined to create a weapon that was obsolete before it fired its guns in anger. The origins of Yamato lay in a treaty signed in Washington, D.C. in 1922, thousands of miles from Japanese shores. The Washington Naval Treaty, designed to prevent a post-World War I arms race, established strict limits on battleship construction. Japan, ranked as a third-tier naval power, was allocated 60% of the tonnage permitted to Britain and America. To Japanese naval officers, this wasn't just a treaty, it was an insult. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who would later plan the Pearl Harbor attack, understood the mathematics of industrial warfare. In the first 6 months of war with America, he would later tell Prime Minister Kano, "I will run wild, but if the war continues for 2 or 3 years, I have no confidence in our ultimate victory." The treaty expired in 1936, and Japan refused to renew it. Finally freed from restrictions, the Imperial Japanese Navy could pursue what they believed would equalize the tonnage disadvantage: individual ship superiority. The logic was seductive. If Japan couldn't match America in numbers, they would build battleships so powerful that each one could defeat 2 or 3 enemy vessels. This wasn't mere theory. Japanese naval architects had studied every capital ship afloat. They knew British and American designs intimately, including their weaknesses. They knew the thickness of armor, the range of guns, the vulnerabilities in underwater protection. Captain Kikuo Fujimoto, leading the design team at the Imperial Navy Technical Department, was given an unprecedented challenge: design a battleship that could defeat any 2 enemy capital ships simultaneously. The constraints were severe. Japanese shipyards couldn't match the size of American facilities. The Panama Canal limited American battleship width to 110 feet, but Japan faced no such restriction. Use it, Fujimoto was told. Build wider. Build heavier. Build invincible. What emerged from Fujimoto's calculations was a vessel that defied every established rule of battleship design. Standard displacement, 65,000 tons, though official documents would claim only 45,000 to maintain the fiction of treaty compliance. Length, 863 feet. Beam, 127 feet. Draft, 34 feet. These dimensions made Yamato 20% heavier than any American battleship, with armor thicker than anything afloat. But it was the main armament that revealed Japan's intentions. 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Each gun weighed 162 tons, stood 70 feet long, and could fire a 3,200-pound armor-piercing shell to a range of 45,000 yards over 25 miles. At that distance, the shell would strike with enough kinetic energy to penetrate 16 inches of hardened steel armor. The Americans had 16-inch guns on their Iowa-class battleships. The British had 16-inch guns on their King George V class. No one had 18.1-inch guns because no one had conceived of needing them. Japanese metallurgists had developed a steel alloy called VH armor, tougher and more resilient than anything in Western arsenals. The main belt armor was 16.1 inches thick, backed by additional layers that brought total protection to over 20 inches in critical areas. Construction began in absolute secrecy at the Kure Naval Arsenal on November 4, 1937. The entire shipyard was surrounded by rope screens to prevent observation from nearby hills. Workers signed documents swearing silence about dimensions, armament, or any technical details under penalty of imprisonment. Aerial photography was prohibited within 5 miles. Even the designation was classified. She was known only as Battleship No. 1. The secrecy was so complete that American naval intelligence, arguably the best in the world, knew Japan was building large battleships but couldn't determine their true size. Estimates ranged from 45,000 to 50,000 tons with 16-inch guns, the maximum they believed Japanese industry could produce. The reality exceeded their most pessimistic projections by 30%. Over 3,000 workers labored on Yamato's hull, working around the clock in shifts. The keel alone required 8,000 tons of special steel. The armor plates, some weighing over 100 tons individually, had to be precisely shaped and fitted. Each main gun turret weighed 2,774 tons, equivalent to a destroyer's displacement. Moving these components into position required cranes built specifically for the project. The launch date was set for August 8, 1940. Symbolism mattered. 8 was considered lucky in Japanese culture, and this would be the 8th month, 8th day. More practically, intelligence reports suggested American photo reconnaissance aircraft were becoming more sophisticated. The longer the hull sat in the yard, the greater the risk of discovery. On that August morning, with minimal ceremony to avoid drawing attention, Yamato slid into the water. Workers who had spent 3 years building her watched in silence. Many would later recall feeling both pride and unease. The ship was magnificent, but she was also proof that Japan expected war with America. No nation builds such weapons for peace. Fitting out continued for another 16 months. Installing the main battery required extraordinary precision. Each gun was rifled with 180 grooves spiraling along its length, imparting spin to stabilize the massive shells in flight. The turrets rotated on ball bearings machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Despite their mass, they could traverse a full 360 degrees in under 3 minutes. The fire control system was a marvel of pre-computer engineering. A massive mechanical calculator in the plotting room below the bridge computed firing solutions based on target range, bearing, speed, wind, air temperature, propellant temperature, barrel wear, and even the rotation of the Earth. The system could track and engage targets beyond visual range, using spotting aircraft to correct fire. Secondary armament included 12 6.1-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, designed to engage enemy cruisers or destroyers that penetrated screening forces. 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns provided anti-aircraft defense, though these would prove woefully inadequate against massed carrier strikes. Later refits would add over 150 25 anti-aircraft guns, covering the deck like a forest of steel. The power plant consisted of 12 boilers feeding 4 steam turbines, generating 150,000 shaft horsepower. This drove 4 propellers, each 20 feet in diameter, pushing the massive hull to a maximum speed of 27 knots. Not fast by destroyer standards, but remarkable for a vessel displacing 72,000 tons fully loaded. Range was 7,200 nautical miles at 16 knots, enough to cross the Pacific without refueling. Living spaces reflected Japanese naval practice, Spartan for enlisted men, relatively comfortable for officers. The crew numbered 2,750 men, each one selected for technical proficiency or combat experience. Serving aboard Yamato was considered an honor. Assignment to Battleship Number 1 marked a sailor as elite. On December 16, 1941, 9 days after Pearl Harbor, Yamato was formally commissioned into the combined fleet. Admiral Yamamoto himself came aboard to inspect the ship he had championed. Walking through the cavernous interior, examining the massive gun turrets, studying the armor that could allegedly resist any shell afloat, the admiral was silent. His staff waited for praise. Instead, Yamamoto simply said, "Let us hope we never need to test her in battle." It was a strange comment for a warrior inspecting the ultimate weapon, but Yamamoto understood what his more enthusiastic subordinates did not. Yamato represented the past. Aircraft carriers represented the future. He had seen the demonstration at Taranto in 1940, where British torpedo bombers crippled the Italian battle fleet in harbor. He had planned Pearl Harbor, proving that carriers could project power across thousands of miles to destroy battleships that never saw their attackers. Yamato's first combat deployment came in June 1942 as the flagship for the Midway operation. Yamamoto commanded from her bridge, coordinating what was supposed to be the decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. The plan was elegant: lure the American carriers into range of overwhelming Japanese naval and air power, destroy them, and force America to negotiate peace. The Americans had other plans. On June 4, 1942, dive bombers from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown caught 4 Japanese carriers with their decks crowded with rearming aircraft. In 5 minutes, the core of Japan's carrier striking power was burning. Yamamoto, receiving the catastrophic reports aboard Yamato 600 miles to the west, ordered a general retreat. The largest battleship ever built, carrying the most powerful guns afloat, never fired a shot. This would become the pattern of Yamato's war. Built to dominate surface engagements, she found herself in a war where battleships were targets, not weapons. American strategy, shaped by bitter lessons from Pearl Harbor, revolved around carrier task forces. Battleships served as anti-aircraft platforms and shore bombardment vessels, supporting the carriers that delivered decisive strikes. Yamato spent most of 1942 and 1943 at anchor in Truk Lagoon, the Japanese Navy's main forward base. Her crew trained endlessly, practicing damage control, gunnery, and anti-aircraft drills. They knew American submarines prowled the approaches. They knew American codebreakers read their messages. They knew every sortie risked submarine ambush. So Yamato stayed put, her massive guns silent, her crew growing restless. The Americans called these inactive Japanese capital ships the fleet in being, a strategic concept where the mere existence of powerful warships constrained enemy operations. As long as Yamato existed, American commanders had to plan for the possibility of her sudden appearance. Carrier task forces kept battleships close for protection against surface threats that never materialized. But fuel shortages, not American power, kept Yamato at anchor. Japan's oil imports had depended on tankers from the Dutch East Indies. American submarines were systematically destroying those tankers. By late 1943, fuel was so scarce that major fleet operations required months of accumulation. Yamato, consuming 3,000 tons of fuel oil on a single sortie, was simply too expensive to operate routinely. The first time Yamato's main guns fired in anger came on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This massive engagement, the largest naval battle in history, represented Japan's last attempt to destroy American amphibious forces in the Philippines. The plan was complex, involving 3 separate task forces converging on Leyte Gulf from different directions. Yamato led Admiral Kurita's center force through the San Bernardino Strait, targeting the American landing beaches. Standing between them and the vulnerable transports was Taffy 3, a collection of 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers never designed to face battleships. When Yamato's lookouts spotted the American ships at dawn, cheers erupted across the ship. Finally, after 3 years, they would prove what their magnificent vessel could do. What followed was chaos. The escort carriers launched every aircraft they had while destroyers charged directly at the Japanese battleships, laying smoke and firing torpedoes with suicidal courage. Commander Ernest Evans, commanding the destroyer USS Johnston, took his 2,000-ton ship directly toward Yamato, firing every gun he had. The Americans knew they were hopelessly outmatched. They attacked anyway. Yamato opened fire at 32,000 yards, her massive shells creating waterspouts 200 feet high as they missed the frantically maneuvering American ships. The problem was speed. The escort carriers could make 17 knots. Yamato could make 27 knots. The Japanese should have closed the range quickly and slaughtered their opponents. Instead, Kurita's battleships maneuvered erratically, confused by smoke, distracted by torpedo attacks, and uncoordinated in their pursuit. Yamato fired 104 rounds from her main battery during the engagement. She claimed hits on one escort carrier, the Gambier Bay, though most damage came from cruiser fire. The massive 18.1-inch shells, designed to penetrate heavy armor, often passed completely through the lightly built American ships without exploding. They were simply too powerful for their targets. Then, inexplicably, Kurita ordered a retreat. His ships had expended enormous ammunition stores. Air attacks were intensifying. He believed he faced fleet carriers, not escort carriers. Whatever his reasoning, he turned away from the landing beaches and steamed back through San Bernardino Strait. Yamato had finally engaged enemy surface forces and achieved nothing decisive. The opportunity would never come again. By early 1945, Japan's strategic situation was hopeless. American forces had conquered the Philippines, taken Iwo Jima, and were preparing to invade Okinawa, just 350 miles from mainland Japan. The combined fleet had been reduced to scattered remnants. Fuel was critically scarce. Trained pilots were dead. The Americans controlled the seas and skies absolutely. In this context, the Imperial Navy staff conceived Operation Tengo, a suicide mission disguised as strategy. Yamato would sail to Okinawa with a token escort of 1 cruiser and 8 destroyers. She would beach herself on the island's shore and use her massive guns as fixed artillery until destroyed. It was madness presented as honor. Admiral Seiichi Ito, commanding the operation, protested bitterly. Sending Yamato on a one-way mission without air cover was murder, not strategy. The ship would be overwhelmed by American carrier aircraft long before reaching Okinawa. Every man aboard would die for nothing. The operation was symbolic suicide, meant to inspire the kamikaze pilots and demonstrate the Navy's willingness to sacrifice. Vice Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, Chief of Staff to Admiral Toyota, presented the plan to Ito and Yamato's senior officers on April 5, 1945. "The fate of the Empire rests on this operation," Kusaka declared. "The entire nation is watching. We expect Yamato to give her all." The officers sat in silence. Everyone understood they were being ordered to die for appearance's sake. Captain Aruga, commanding Yamato, asked the obvious question, "Will we receive air support?" Kusaka's reply was brutal in its honesty. "There will be no air support. All available aircraft are committed to kamikaze operations. Yamato will proceed alone." The officers looked at each other. Alone meant defenseless. Against American carrier task forces, it meant certain destruction. Admiral Ito stood, his face showing the strain of commanding men to pointless death. "Very well," he said quietly. "If the Empire requires this sacrifice, we will make it." Then he added something remarkable. "But I will not order married men or those with families to participate. Any man who wishes to remain behind may do so without dishonor." Of Yamato's 2,750 crew, fewer than 200 took this offer. They would die together. Yamato sailed from Tokuyama on April 6 at 3:00 p.m., steering southwest through the Bungo Channel into the Pacific. Accompanying her were the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. No carriers, no air cover, no hope. Sailors lined the rails as they passed coastal villages, seeing Japan for the last time. Many wrote final letters, sealed them in waterproof containers, and left them in their lockers to be found after the ship's sinking. The Americans knew Yamato was coming before she cleared the harbor. Submarines had reported her departure. Intelligence had decrypted the operational orders. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, authorized Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 to intercept and destroy the Japanese force. Mitcher had 11 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, carrying over 1,000 aircraft. It would be a massacre. On the morning of April 7th, American search planes located Yamato steaming south at 18 knots. Weather was deteriorating, with heavy clouds and occasional rain squalls. Admiral Ito hoped the weather would hide them long enough to reach Okinawa. It was a futile hope. American radar saw through clouds and darkness. Yamato was as visible to them as if sailing in bright sunlight. At 10:00 a.m., Ito received reports of massive American air formations approaching. He ordered the formation into anti-aircraft disposition, with destroyers spreading out to provide overlapping fire. Yamato's gun crews had trained for this. They knew how to track aircraft, how to lead targets, how to coordinate fire. What they hadn't trained for was the sheer number of attackers. The first wave arrived at 12:30 p.m. Over 280 aircraft from 6 carriers, more planes than Japan had launched at Pearl Harbor. They came in coordinated groups: torpedo bombers low on the water, dive bombers high above, fighters strafing to suppress anti-aircraft fire. The American pilots had studied Yamato's profile, understood her capabilities, knew exactly where to aim. Yamato's anti-aircraft guns opened fire at maximum range. The sky filled with black bursts of flak. Tracers from 25 guns created a web of fire around the ship. Several American aircraft fell burning into the sea. But they kept coming, wave after wave, more than the gunners could track. It was like trying to stop a flood with buckets. The first torpedo struck Yamato's port side at 12:40 p.m. just after the forward turrets. The explosion lifted the bow, sending shudders through the massive hull. Then another torpedo hit, then another. American torpedo bombers, flying just feet above the waves, were impossible to track with heavy guns. The 25 weapons lacked the rate of fire to stop them all. Dive bombers screamed down from 10,000 feet, releasing 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs that struck with devastating effect. Several penetrated the deck armor, exploding deep inside the ship. Fires erupted throughout the interior. The plotting room flooded. The steering gear was damaged. Still, Yamato fought on, her massive guns firing special anti-aircraft shells that burst into thousands of incendiary fragments. A second wave arrived at 1:00 p.m., another 100 aircraft from 3 more carriers. They concentrated on Yamato's port side, knowing that multiple torpedo hits on one side would cause catastrophic flooding. Naval architects designed battleships to withstand damage distributed evenly around the hull. Concentrated damage on a single side caused lists that could not be corrected. The torpedoes struck one after another, 5 hits in rapid succession, all on the port side. Yamato began to list, slowly at first, then more rapidly. Water flooded through the massive wounds in her hull, filling compartments faster than pumps could compensate. The list reached 10 degrees, then 15 degrees. Damage control teams worked desperately, counter-flooding compartments on the starboard side to correct the list. On the bridge, Captain Aruga watched instruments showing progressive flooding. The engineering officer reported loss of power to several compartments. The gunnery officer reported decreasing ammunition. The medical officer reported hundreds of casualties. Aruga knew his ship was dying. The only question was how long she would take. Admiral Ito, standing beside Aruga, remained calm. He had accepted death days ago. Now he focused on ensuring his men died with honor. He ordered all classified documents destroyed. He ordered the battle flag lowered and saved. He ordered final messages transmitted to combined fleet headquarters. Then he tied himself to the compass pedestal to ensure he would go down with his ship. At 2:00 p.m., a third wave of American aircraft arrived. The pilots reported Yamato listing heavily, burning, dead in the water. Some felt pity for the men aboard the dying ship. Others remembered Pearl Harbor and pressed their attacks with grim determination. More torpedoes struck. More bombs penetrated her deck. The list increased to 20 degrees, then 25 degrees. Below decks, conditions were hellish. Fires raged out of control. Steam lines ruptured, scalding men alive. Flooding compartments trapped damage control parties. The wounded lay in sick bay as the deck tilted beneath them, knowing they would drown when the ship capsized. Some men prayed. Some sang naval songs. Some simply waited for the end. At 2:05 p.m., with the list approaching 30 degrees, Captain Aruga gave his final order. All hands abandon ship. It was already too late. Men trying to climb the sloping deck found themselves sliding into the water. Others, trapped below by jammed hatches or flooding passageways, never had a chance to escape. The ship that was supposed to be unsinkable was dying in less than 2 hours of sustained attack. The list reached 45 degrees. Yamato rolled onto her side, her massive hull suspended for a moment parallel to the sea surface. Men jumped from the exposed hull into water covered with burning oil. The destroyers, themselves under attack, could save only a few. Then, at 2:23 p.m., the end came with appalling finality. The forward main magazine, containing hundreds of tons of explosives for the 18.1-inch guns, detonated. The explosion was visible over 100 miles away, a column of fire and smoke rising 20,000 feet into the sky. The blast wave capsized nearby vessels. The shock was felt by American aircraft thousands of feet above. When the smoke cleared, Yamato was gone. The largest battleship ever built had been erased from the ocean. Of 2,750 men aboard, only 280 survived. Admiral Ito went down with his ship, as did Captain Aruga and most of the senior officers. The survivors, pulled from the oil-covered water by destroyers, watched the spot where Yamato disappeared, unable to comprehend that the mighty ship was simply gone. The cruiser Yahagi and 4 of the 8 destroyers were also sunk. Japan's last major surface force had been annihilated. The American pilots returned to their carriers having expended 386 bombs and torpedoes. They claimed at least 10 torpedo hits and possibly 20, along with numerous bomb strikes. 10 American aircraft were shot down, 20 aircrew killed. The exchange rate was catastrophic for Japan. 4,250 sailors and 1 irreplaceable battleship for 20 American flyers. The news of Yamato's sinking was kept from the Japanese public for weeks. When finally announced, it was presented as a heroic sacrifice, a glorious last stand against overwhelming odds. The truth was harder to accept. The largest battleship ever built, the symbol of Japanese naval power, the vessel that was supposed to be invincible, had been destroyed without ever seriously threatening American forces. Post-war analysis revealed the fundamental flaws in Yamato's design philosophy. She was built to fight American battleships in a surface engagement that never occurred. Her armor, though magnificent, was useless against aerial torpedoes striking below the waterline. Her anti-aircraft armament, though numerous, lacked the range and firepower to defend against massed carrier strikes. The 18.1-inch guns, the ship's primary weapons, fired fewer than 300 rounds in anger during her entire service life. At Samar, they proved ineffective against small, fast-moving targets. At Okinawa, they never fired at all. The weapons that were supposed to dominate naval warfare were rendered irrelevant by aircraft carrying torpedoes that cost a fraction of a single shell. American observers studying Japanese records after the war were struck by the disconnect between engineering excellence and strategic reality. Yamato represented extraordinary technical achievement. Her designers solved problems in armor metallurgy, propulsion, and fire control that impressed Western naval architects. But technical excellence without strategic relevance is merely expensive futility. The cost of building Yamato and her sister Musashi exceeded the cost of building every Japanese carrier constructed during the war. The steel used in their hulls could have built dozens of destroyers or hundreds of aircraft. The resources devoted to these two battleships represented a strategic misdirection that Japan could not afford. Some historians argue that Yamato's mere existence justified her cost by forcing American planners to account for her potential appearance. This fleet in being argument has merit, but ignores the opportunity cost. The carriers Japan desperately needed in 1944 could have been built with Yamato's resources in 1940. By the time Japan recognized carriers as decisive, it was too late to shift production. The cultural factors cannot be ignored. Yamato represented more than military hardware. She embodied national pride, technological achievement, and the warrior spirit that defined the Imperial Navy. Abandoning the battleship concept would have required admitting that Western powers understood naval warfare better than Japan did. This was psychologically impossible for officers raised in the samurai tradition. The tragedy is that the men who sailed aboard Yamato knew her limitations. Captain Aruga understood that sailing into range of American carriers without air cover was suicide. Admiral Ito protested the pointlessness of Operation Tengo. The crew, watching American aircraft darken the sky, knew they were facing industrial power that individual courage could not overcome. Yet they sailed anyway, because Japanese military culture valued sacrifice over survival, honor over effectiveness. The idea of preserving Yamato for a battle she might win was rejected in favor of expending her in a gesture that accomplished nothing. This wasn't strategy. It was ritual suicide on a national scale. The wreck of Yamato lies in 1,120 feet of water, 200 miles southwest of Kyushu. Her hull, broken by the magazine explosion, rests upside down on the seafloor. Rust covers the armor that was supposed to be impenetrable. Marine life inhabits the gun turrets that once symbolized ultimate power. She has become a tomb for 2,470 men who died serving a weapon system their nation should have abandoned years earlier. Explorers who have dived the wreck describe a scene of frozen violence. The bow section, separated from the main hull by the magazine explosion, lies hundreds of yards away. Personal effects, sake cups, photographs, letters home, still litter the wreck. The massive propellers, each blade taller than a man, are buried in sediment. The guns, pointed at angles suggesting the turrets were engaging targets when she capsized, are slowly collapsing under corrosion. In Japan, Yamato occupies a complex place in national memory. She represents both technological achievement and strategic failure, martial valor, and pointless sacrifice. Museums display artifacts recovered from the wreck alongside technical diagrams explaining her innovations. But there's also recognition that her construction diverted resources Japan desperately needed elsewhere. The battleship age ended with Yamato. No nation has built a battleship since 1945. The lessons were too clear. Aircraft carriers project power across hundreds of miles. Submarines hunt unseen beneath the waves. Guided missiles strike with precision from beyond visual range. The era when massive guns and thick armor decided naval supremacy ended in the skies above the East China Sea on April 7, 1945. What makes Yamato's story compelling is not her technical specifications, impressive though they were. It's the human dimension, the designers who poured genius into creating her, the workers who built her in secret, the sailors who served aboard her knowing she represented both national pride and strategic delusion, the officers who commanded her into battle they knew was futile, the men who died aboard her when national policy demanded sacrifice over sense. Admiral Yamamoto, who championed Yamato's construction but understood carriers were the future, died in 1943 when American fighters shot down his aircraft. He never saw his flagship's final mission. Perhaps that was mercy. Watching the culmination of his work destroyed by the weapon systems he had pioneered would have been bitter vindication of his warnings. The crew members who survived Yamato's sinking rarely spoke publicly about their experience. The shame of survival when so many died, the trauma of watching their ship torn apart, the memory of shipmates drowning in burning oil, these were not topics for casual conversation. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and prospered, Yamato became a symbol of a past best left unexamined. But in recent years, as the generation that fought the war passes, there's been renewed interest in Yamato's story, not as military propaganda, but as historical tragedy. Films, books, and documentaries examine her creation and destruction with a critical eye that would have been impossible decades earlier. The question they ask is not whether she was technically magnificent, obviously she was, but whether her magnificence mattered. The answer history provides is uncomfortable. Technical excellence without strategic relevance is wasted effort. Individual courage without effective weapons is noble sacrifice that accomplishes nothing. National pride that rejects strategic reality leads to catastrophic defeat. These lessons transcend Yamato's specific story. They apply to any military force that confuses impressive hardware with effective strategy. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever built, never sank an enemy capital ship. Her armor, thicker than any battleship afloat, couldn't protect against aerial torpedoes. Her speed, impressive for her size, couldn't outrun carrier aircraft. Her crew, trained to excellence, died in a battle their leaders knew was unwinnable. Every superlative describing Yamato is followed by a caveat explaining why it didn't matter. The final assessment must be that Yamato represented magnificent irrelevance. She was the ultimate expression of a weapon system that had already been superseded. Building her consumed resources Japan needed for carriers, submarines, and aircraft. Operating her consumed fuel Japan couldn't spare. Destroying her required American forces that could have been employed elsewhere, but ultimately cost America almost nothing while costing Japan everything. In the end, the largest battleship ever built became the largest symbol of strategic miscalculation ever constructed. Her wreck lies not just on the ocean floor, but in the historical record as evidence that engineering brilliance without strategic wisdom produces weapons that are simultaneously impressive and irrelevant. The men who designed her, built her, and died aboard her deserved better. They deserved leadership that understood that wars are won not by the most impressive weapons, but by the most effective strategy. The thunder of Yamato's guns, which should have dominated Pacific battlefields, was silenced by the thunder of aircraft engines Japan couldn't match. The armor that should have made her invincible was pierced by torpedoes she couldn't avoid. The glory that should have attended her service was replaced by the tragedy of pointless sacrifice. She was the largest battleship ever built, the most powerful surface combatant ever launched, and the clearest proof that in modern warfare, individual superiority means nothing against systematic supremacy. Yamato's story is Japan's story in miniature: technical excellence, martial valor, strategic delusion, and catastrophic defeat. Understanding her requires understanding not just naval architecture, but national psychology, strategic thought, and the hard mathematics of industrial warfare. She was built to be invincible and died after 2 hours of combat. She was designed to dominate and spent most of her career at anchor. She was created to save Japan, and instead symbolized why Japan was always going to lose. The men who died aboard her on April 7, 1945, deserved better than to perish in a gesture designed to salve national pride. They deserved strategy that recognized reality, leadership that valued their lives over symbolism, and a nation that understood that wars are won by economics and production, not by individual weapons however impressive. Their sacrifice bought nothing. Their deaths accomplished nothing. Their courage, undeniable and absolute, was wasted on a mission that should never have been ordered. This is the tragedy of Yamato. Not that she was destroyed, but that she was built at all. Not that her crew died bravely, but that they had to die at all. Not that Japan lost the naval war, but that Japan fought the naval war it wanted rather than the naval war that existed. The largest battleship ever constructed became the most expensive lesson in strategic thinking ever purchased. The price was paid in steel, oil, and 4,250 lives that should have been spent more wisely. The wreck lies still in the darkness, a tomb and a monument, to the men who served aboard her, to the nation that built her, and to the hard truth that courage and engineering cannot overcome strategic reality. Yamato was supposed to be invincible. Instead, she proved that nothing is invincible when employed wrongly, built for the wrong war and sacrificed for the wrong reasons. Her story deserves to be told, not to glorify, but to remember and to learn from the mistakes that sent 2,470 men to the bottom alongside the largest, most powerful, most utterly irrelevant battleship ever built.